They jumped in like it was a holiday laughter. Splash. That careless kind of shouting that rips right through a quiet morning, and for a moment, I just stood there on the back steps. Coffee gone cold in my hand. Trying to remember if I'd left the gate unlocked. Then I saw her. Sitting on an inflatable like she owned the sun. Hair pulled back. A smile that didn't belong to anybody's good day. And I realized something else. This wasn't a mistake. This was a takeover. My name is Frank Harper. I fixed other people's problems for a living, wiring houses. Running conduit. Making stubborn lights behave, and for a long while. I thought I could fix just about anything. I couldn't fix that morning. I couldn't fix the feeling of my own place being rearranged around me. Like a thief who didn't bother to use the door. People talk about property like it's just ground and material. My little pool. A deck I refinished the year my kid left for college. A barbecue with a burnt grill lid that still remembers steak smoke. To me, it was sanctuary. It was where I learned how to breathe after being up to my elbows in wires. Where I sat at midnight with a beer and let the backyard noise of crickets and distant traffic stitch me back together. It was the kind of small thing you couldn't easily explain to someone who'd never had to build quiet out of spare time and thrift store tools. So when the HOA president Evelyn Crane and a gaggle of people treated my yard like a public amenity, it felt like a betrayal in the bones. Evelyn was polished in ways that made you think she'd been born with a gavel. She wore linen in August. Had a laugh that landed like an announcement. And a habit of turning rules into a kind of personal script. She'd been the kind of person who loved meetings. She loved the feeling of a room agreeing with her. I'm not saying she was evil. People aren't comic book villains in real life, but she wanted order and influence, and more. She wanted control. At the first HOA meeting, she pulled up a slide deck and told the room that amenities must be designated in the community register. That community benefit trumped private whims. And that the little pool by the Harper property had no permits for public usage. She used words like non-compliant and community cohesion, and I almost laughed because I had never once considered my pool to be a community amenity. I'd put my own money into the liner. Hired a guy to level the ground. Fixed the pump after a lightning strike. It was mine. Her paper said otherwise, or at least she said it did, and she set a fine. Not enormous, but precise enough. Like a paper cut, $1. 500. That night I sat on the edge of the pool and watched my reflection wobble and thought about where my life had been heading. A modest house. A job that smelled like old metal and sweat. A kid who was away and sent a postcard once a year. I thought about how tiny sanctuaries become everything. I thought about how the people who want to manage everyone else's tiny things are rarely volunteers in the way the rest of us are. I decided to document. Cameras are a kind of truth-telling for people who don't trust words alone. I put up 2 small, ugly things on the eaves and pointed them my way like a set of unblinking witnesses. They didn't hum or judge. They just recorded. The first week they caught neighbors walking past with dogs. A couple of kids kicking a soccer ball too close to the fence. And then on a bubble-bright morning, Evelyn and half a dozen folks strolling through my yard. Shoes leaving wet prints. Evelyn carrying a clipboard like she'd brought a ceremony. Just taking measurements for the registry. She said when I opened the sliding door and asked what the hell she thought she was doing. Her voice was perfectly even, that same practiced cadence she used at meetings. You can't treat my property like a community garden. I said. You don't get to decide that here. She smiled like someone who'd been handed a prop. Frank, we're trying to make the neighborhood safer for everyone. Shared access reduces conflict. You know how people get, they assume exclusion leads to resentment. There were other things I remember about that day. The way the water lapped the pool edge as if nothing had changed. The look a man gave me who was standing behind Evelyn, a realtor. Maybe. There were brochures in his hand like he'd been waiting for an opening. For a second it felt like negotiation. Like there might be some middle ground. Then he winked at Evelyn, and I realized the middle ground was a line on a spreadsheet and not mine. Things escalated with a bureaucratic efficiency kids would admire. A fine became a complaint. Which became inspections. Which became a letter indicating that my insurance might be considered invalid if the pool remained an unregistered amenity. I got calls with measured concern. I got emails with attached forms and the same phrases: community impact, non-compliant use, potential liability. And then the small acts of vandalism started. A gate hinge twisted the wrong way. Cushions were slashed. Someone threw a rock into the pool and left a note, a cheap bit of cowardice saying, We own this now. Whoever did it wanted a reaction. They wanted me raw. You start to learn people very closely when they're trying to erode your life with grief tactics. I learned that Evelyn loved controlling narrative. She'd rewrite stories into bylaws and make other people feel ridiculous for the messiness of living. I learned that a group of people, when they find an authority figure who says the right legal-sounding things, will rally like a small army. Silence is a weapon. So is fear. Helen showed up like a small lighthouse. She was practical and quiet. Worked as a paralegal at a small firm and had that particular stare people get when their hands know how paperwork binds a life. She was also my neighbor and had kids who'd swam in the pool last summer. She didn't want to be a hero. She wanted to be fair. When I told her what was happening, she read the HOA covenants like someone reading a recipe. And she started to point out the inconsistencies like spices you wouldn't expect to find. Look here, she said, tapping a clause. If an amenity is to be community accessible, it has to be voted in, with documentation and recorded minutes. There's no vote about your pool. There's nothing. Evelyn isn't allowed to just declare it. Her voice had that warm, relentless thing people with a legal background have. She added, also, they can't just walk on a private property without notice. That's trespass. Together we started to put things together like a puzzle: receipts for my pool, invoices, my insurance history, photos of the job the day the liner went in. Helen taught me how to make my anger useful. Documentation is a kind of armor. It's not satisfying like yelling, but it holds. I showed the surveillance footage to a few people who mattered: Helen, a CPA named Linda who lived down the street, and a friend who wrote for a local paper, Robert, who could sniff out threadbare scandals. Robert's eyes lit up when he saw the clip of Evelyn laughing on the inflatable, then walking the pool's edge with the realtor. They're selling spectacle, he said. If she can claim it's a community asset, she can pitch the neighborhood as amenitized and bump values. Realtors love that. We started seeing patterns. Inspections were scheduled with short notice and odd justifications. Checks from HOA coffers were made out to shell companies that didn't have any physical presence in town. Linda had a knack for numbers, and she found transfers that had the kind of dance you see when money disappears into fog, payments to vendors who were actually Evelyn's brother's businesses. An odd consulting fee here. A maintenance contract there that somehow cost far more than maintenance ever does. When you see the paper trail, you start to make inferences that taste like cold metal. You start rationalizing in the face of your own outrage. Maybe they were sloppy. Maybe someone was taking advantage. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. And then you find a pulse where you didn't expect one: a canceled check with a familiar signature. A deposit to a bank you know the realtor uses. A wire transfer timed with an unusually lavish HOA picnic. Patterns, once recognized, are hard to unsee. People react to being exposed in different ways. Some apologize. Some deny. And some get mean. Evelyn chose mean. She doubled down. When Robert filed a small piece about the suspicious transfers, Evelyn sent an email to the community accusing him of reckless reporting and hinted that Robert had some dog in the fight. She organized emergency meetings. She put out a statement suggesting that anyone questioning the HOA was being selfish and destabilizing property values. She said the thing people say when they want to paint you as an enemy of the collective good. I'll tell you right now, anger is a fine tool when it's steady. But if you let it set your hands shaking, you lose more than you gain. So we stayed steady. I didn't post rants on neighborhood forums or go on camera like some kind of vigilante. I gathered witnesses. I saved emails. When my cameras were smashed one night, lenses splintered by a blunt object, I kept the fragments and took them to the police. They said they'd send an officer. They came around, made a report, and took the smashed cameras like little quiet soldiers whose mission had been interrupted. The intimidation got cruder. Someone left a letter on my porch, anonymous. Of course, threatening litigation and reminding me of the consequences of inciting the community. One evening, as I put in new cameras, a truck full of men idled at the corner and stared like vultures. I called the police again. Helen sat up with me that night while the rain drummed, as if our presence would make the backyard less inviting to trouble. She told me a story about a client who'd been quietly squeezed by a landlord until the tenant left town. People sometimes think they can win by wearing you down, she said. They count on your patience being finite. Don't let them. The plan we hatched wasn't glamorous. It was messy, legal, and required the kind of patience that sits like a small stone in your shoe. We filed formal complaints with the county, making the issue a public one and not just a neighborhood whisper. We subpoenaed HOA records. We asked the bank for transaction histories. We compiled witness statements. Linda did the math that made the alleged embezzlement sing, small amounts here, diverted through a network. Added up. They became a preposterous sum. It wasn't about money for me anymore, it was about a principle that felt simple and vital. If you call yourself a steward of a community, you don't get to use that title to plunder trust. There was a turning point where the world shrank and the stakes became very real. At a weekend board meeting, I played a recording from one of the surveillance clips, Evelyn speaking with that same facile charm, and asked a simple question. Why are you allowing showings at my property without my consent? She bristled. She accused me of invading privacy. She waived her own folder minutes. She insisted that somehow authorized these showings. Her voice moderated in the way that tells you a person is already planning the next move. I expected the board to bow to the optics of the footage. I expected them to be embarrassed and to call for an apology. But people who gain power slowly sometimes tend to stay loyal to the power itself. They're less interested in the truth than in the continuity of their world. Instead of a mea culpa, there was a procedural call to refer the matter to a committee. It was like being told a house is on fire and asked to wait for a form to be filled out. That's when we changed tactics. Rather than let the HOA process us to exhaustion, we decided to pull the rug. We coordinated with Robert to plan an expose timed to the annual meeting, the one meeting almost everyone in Willow Ridge attends because it means votes, budgets, and the illusion of community input. If we could present the documents, the recordings, and a forensic accountant's report in the bright light of a packed hall and with the press in the room, the theatrics that Evelyn loved might not save her. Preparation felt like preparing for a storm. Linda printed decades of bank statements and highlighted transfers. Helen prepared a concise timeline that could be read aloud without losing people in legalese. Robert lined up a local journalist friend who agreed to be in the room and placed the story on the front page the next morning. I practiced the few lines I would say until they felt as calm as breathing. The week of the meeting, things went sideways. Someone broke into my shed and cut the wires to the second set of cameras. A note was taped to my mailbox. Stop digging. There was a broken bottle near the back door, shards glinting like small regrets. My neighbor had her tires slashed. It looked like a campaign of terror designed to make the idea of exposing corruption more expensive than staying quiet. It's important to name fear when you feel it. Fear sits in your throat and makes sentences sound like challenges. I named it. The police increased patrols that week. Helen drove me to the meeting and sat with me in the car while the parking lot filled with people who were mostly polite and mostly unaware that anything was wrong. I told her I didn't want to make a spectacle out of my life. I wanted to make sure nobody else had to go through this without a fight. Inside the meeting hall, the lights felt too bright. Evelyn sat at the head table with a smile like a seal. She presented budget items and new proposals in that voice that had once been so persuasive. People applauded the line items. Part of what makes small-town governance work is the illusion of consensus. When the floor opened for new business, I arrived early, slid to the microphone, and told the room briefly who I was and why I'd come. Helen read the timeline first. Short, steady, human. Linda summarized the accounting discrepancies, her voice clear and devoid of theatricality. Robert's journalist friend stood and described how often he's seen municipal systems get used for personal gain. Then I played the recordings. I watched faces in the room as Evelyn's carefully manicured image softened into the evidence. Photos of her on my deck. Emails arranging showings. Invoices to shell companies, the kind of mundane proof that's more damning than melodrama, because it shows intent. You could feel the mood shift, like a conversation that had been polite and then went blunt. Evelyn stood and nearly shouted over us. This is harassment. You're trying to ruin my reputation. She accused us of lies and said she'd call the police. But the police were already in the room as observers. Sometimes the institutions you think will protect you are quicker to act when the story has weight and witnesses. Someone in the back, a woman who'd been quiet for years, stood up. I donated to the HOA picnic, she said. I thought it went to community use. Now I wonder where the money went. Her voice was soft, but it cracked something the size of a ledger in the room. The law has a strange beauty. It doesn't always mete out justice. But it does make people account for their actions when evidence is presented. Evelyn's allies shuffled, looking for an argument that could change the facts. You can call a record disputed. You can call an accounting sloppy. But when an independent auditor points to transfers and a copy of a canceled check with your name, the language of the room changes. The fallout was swift, procedural, and inevitable in a way that surprised me. An external audit was launched. The county's financial inspector requested access to records. The local paper ran the story with a headline that made my stomach do. Curious Flip's exposure is strange like that. A relief and a spotlight at once. Evelyn resigned from her HOA role a week later, claiming she needed time to address personal matters. Her brother's company contracts were suspended pending review. They say the system is slow. Sometimes it's not slow at all when there is enough scrutiny. But it wasn't a clean ending. People who wield power don't disappear without leaving sharp things behind. Evelyn's defenders argued that she'd been trying to protect the neighborhood. And there are people who still believe that. Some friends stopped speaking to me for months because they felt the scandal made them uncomfortable. Others quietly thanked me for refusing to let quiet be weaponized. The neighborhood was torn. Some wanted a public reckoning with community forums and bylaws rewritten. Others wanted us to move on, to pick up the broken cushions and pretend the theft never happened. The criminal investigation into the financial irregularities took months. There were subpoenas, bank freezes, and a few quiet arrests, not the melodramatic cuffs you see on television. More folded paperwork and the report of a gavel in a courtroom. In the end, restitution orders were issued and some of the misdirected funds returned. There were consequences. Not perfectly measured, but real enough. The pool, after all that, felt like a battleground that needed tending. It was a place that had been used as both refuge and weapon. I repainted the fence, replaced the loungers, and spent a Sunday overhauling the pump. Helen lobbied for a new HOA governance structure with a transparency clause and mandated voting procedures for designating community amenities. We agreed on a simple plaque by the gate, private property respect requested. It was small, blunt, and necessary. I don't say any of this to make a hero out of myself. I was tired, often scared, and guilty about how much time it consumed. The truth is more complicated. The fight cost friendships. It cost comfortable evenings. It made me look at how easily we hand authority to people who like to speak in big pronouncements. And it made me understand that the work of a community is not found only in committees and declarations. It's found in the small, stubborn work of neighbors looking out for one another. There were quieter triumphs, too. The neighbor who'd stood up at the meeting started a volunteer bookkeeping group for the HOA so people could see every check. Robert wrote a follow-up piece about better municipal oversight for small communities. And the county instituted a simple review process for small homeowner associations. People started actually reading the HOA minutes instead of assuming they were ceremonial. Helen ran for a seat on the board and won. She installed a public ledger online that tracked every expenditure. There was a hum of accountability that, once started, is hard to extinguish. Still, the ending was not tidy. Evelyn's life after the scandal had its own arc. She moved away, according to a neighbor. Some of her supporters defended her until the end. That's often how these things end, real people with competing narratives, each with their own truth. I think the messy middle is where we live, and it's there we have to be brave enough to keep the lights on. I found, in the aftermath, new respect for the smallness of things. I went back to my work with a carefulness that felt like prayer. Fixing a bad splice in a wire suddenly seemed less trivial. The wire is the line that keeps things connected. Keeping the backyard gate locked felt like a promise to myself that I would guard the little sanctuaries that keep me human. There's something I want people to hear about this, about power and small places. Corruption rarely arrives with a trumpet. It comes with polite emails, with someone who sounds reasonable and knows how to speak for the group. It arrives with the idea that for the good of the many justifies trimming the edges of a few people's rights. The remedy is not violence or vindictiveness. The remedy is attention, record-keeping, neighbors who talk to one another, and the kind of transparency that makes shadow economies awkward. If you take anything from my story, Take this. Don't let the architecture of your life be rearranged without proof. Don't let words like community be used to excuse secrecy. And if you find yourself feeling small because someone else is loudly asserting control, remember that small people, collected, are formidable. So I'll ask you in the comments below. Tell me what you would have done in my place. Is private property sacred, or is the idea of community a higher calling? Where do you draw the line when neighborhood governance starts to feel like top-down control? Have you ever seen an HOA used as a lever for personal gain? Share your stories. I want to know how other people have fixed their own messy human problems. If this resonated with you, share this with someone who's had a neighborhood run-in. If you like the pacing, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about land, rights, and the small fights that remind us what matters.